if you'll remember last week when we did 1 Kings 3, 1 through 15, we had Solomon ask for wisdom. And so then what we get in the following chapters, hey guys. That's the way to make an entrance, just hitting people along the way and just throw your hands up and take some high fives, All right, we're officially at the same amount we were last week. Nobody else can come in. I'm just kidding. If anybody's out there, come on in. All right, so in the following sections, some of them we will get examples of Solomon's wisdom. And so some of this is going to have to do with the judiciary and Solomon's judgments, right? And so if you'll remember, this is a big deal, right? So you have the law in the ancient world. When you had a legal code, remember that reflected positively on the king. A legal code was not necessarily definitive rules that you had to follow, but it was examples of what good judgments look like, right? So again, that's the reason that you don't have every possible situation in the Old Testament law, right? So it's to provide you with an example or examples of what good judgments look like, so that if you're a judge, then you know what it looks like, you're familiar with it, and so therefore you can make similar types of judgments. So it's more of an example. The reason that ancient kings had law codes was to show that they expect order out of their kingdoms, right? And so that was a positive thing from people looking from the outside. It was like, oh, they have it together. This king, in this nation, they really have it together. And so, they have a law code. So that's a positive thing. Of course, the Old Testament law is the law of God, and God is the king of Israel until they have earthly kings. And so it serves the same purpose. The law in the Old Testament is to show nations around that the God of Israel expects law and justice amongst his people. And then, of course, for the kings, it's the same thing. Israel expects law. The king should be the one who is judicious and follows law in a fair manner, right? And so that's what all of this verse stuff is about. It's about examples of Solomon taking that to heart, asking for wisdom, and then showing that he can mete out justice in a fair manner to his people, right? Because that's what you want as a king, is you want to be able to be a good, just king to your citizens. And so we have an example here that's odd in a couple of manners, and we'll see at the end if you can kind of figure out the things that are maybe a little different that we probably will not think about. So at 1 Kings 3:16 through 28, which is right after his prayer for wisdom, it says, Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house, only we 2 were in the house." Okay, so that sets up, obviously, that there's nobody else to witness what happened. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him, right? Which is a horrible tragedy, obviously, and that actually happens, horrible tragedy. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept and laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. So she switches the children. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born. But the other woman said, "No, the living child is mine and the dead child is yours." The first said, "No, the dead child is yours and the living child is mine." Thus they spoke before the king. Where are they? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to the Morris County judge down there? No, they're talking to who? The king of Israel, right? Okay, there's a hint there. Then the king said, The one says, this is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other, right? Which is obviously a horrifying deal if you were, if he was actually serious and he was really going to do that. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, so the actual mother, because her heart yearned for her son, oh, my lord, give her the living child and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall neither be neither mine nor yours. Divide him, right? So obviously the mother, she cares about the child, wants him to live no matter what. Then you have the other woman who's like, I don't care, he can die, whatever, right? So then that's, for Solomon, he's like, okay, well, there you have it. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice, right? So again, justice. It's all about being a just king. Now, what's interesting about this? First of all, the fact that they just go where? They go to the king to hear this case, right? So that's pretty amazing, right? What else is interesting about this? So they're before the king. Who might you expect would go before the king? I mean, like important people, right? Like upper classes and stuff, right? It's two prostitutes, right? And so again, it's not only justice, but it's justice for the lowliest class citizens, right? In other words, it's the people that people would think the least about. But Solomon, that the point here is that Solomon even hears their cases, right? And so that's part of it. All right, Solomon has a positive international reputation because, again, keep in mind, Solomon's just become king, right? And so a lot of this first part, remember, it's inspired by God, but it's written by humans, right, in ways that humans write. And so much of this is going to be to put up Solomon as an example of what a king should be like and to show that he's rightfully the king, right? As opposed to his older brother, right, that he's already had killed, so he's obviously not going to be the king. So, not anymore, at least. Not from not trying, though. He definitely tried a few times, which got him killed, so if he'd have just stayed in his lane. All right. So, note that he works with Hiram of Tyre, which Tyre is going to be just north of Israel, and he works with the king of Tyre to build the temple, right? And so they exchange some money and some properties and different things. And then it turns out king is like, hey, you know what? I don't like these properties that you gave me. And it sounds like he wanted some oceanfront property. And that sounds like a joke, but no joke. He, because Tyre was a port city, right? And so he probably wanted more port cities. And instead he got some cities in Galilee. And he's like, well, what am I going to do with all this land right in the middle of nowhere? And even then, it would have been nice, fertile land, right? Galilee was a nice place. So, it'd be like if you got nice land, in Coleman, not on the lake, right? But it's still nice land. And you're like, well, this is still nice land, but it's not on the lake. So,
I've tried.
Yeah. All right, so then so that shows that he's able to deal with other nations and stuff and such. And then you have the Queen of Sheba. So the Queen of Sheba is going to be from southern Arabia, so probably Yemen today, right? So it's probably what we think of as Yemen today, or what we think of what is definitely Yemen today, right? Well, we just consider it Yemen, So 1 Kings 10, 1 through 13. It says, now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, and again, that's capitalized, so it's Yahweh, it uses the proper name of God, she came to test him with hard questions, right? So she wants to come and see all that Solomon has. So he has a reputation. Again, none of this is by accident. This story about the Queen of Sheba is not just here because, that was interesting that time that the Queen of Sheba came to visit. It's to show that Solomon has a reputation amongst the nations, right? And so even the Queen of Sheba comes to visit. And she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food at his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. So it literally took her breath away. And she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and your wisdom. But I did not believe their reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpassed the report that I heard, right? And note that that's part of what God said that he would get. He said that he would get the wisdom and the prosperity. But we're going to have this consistent tension concerning his prosperity, because some of the prosperity is exactly the stuff that he's not supposed to be going after, right? And so you have that kind of back and forth where sometimes it's a positive thing and it's from God, but then other times it should be clear to us that it's a bad thing, and we'll go over that in a minute. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. He has made you king that you may execute justice and righteousness, right? So again, you have this whole idea of justice and righteousness, and she hears about Yahweh and she hears about Solomon. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to work at this moment, right? That's exactly the way things are supposed to work. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Note that that amount of gold is more than what King Hiram had given him for that he had given for all of the stuff that he got for the temple and everything. So he basically gets that money back. And we can go ahead and say it here. Note that all of this stuff is a reflection of how great Solomon's reputation is. The fact that she's bringing all of this gold and stuff, it's like tribute to him because of his great name, right? So again, all of this is just piling up like, look at how awesome Solomon is. God's really blessed him. You know, God is great. All these things are going well. Look at Israel, how spectacular it is at this moment, right? And, take a picture of it, because this is chapter 10. We're actually going to go back and do other stuff. But I jumped to chapter 10 just because it has to do with, the wealth and everything. But, in chapter 11, that's when the wheels fall off and we start, worshiping pagan gods and stuff, right? We were that close. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a very great amount of almug wood and precious stones. And the king made of the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for the singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. And King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, besides what was given her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. Right? So again, the point of this story is that he's so great, other people want to come to him, and it's to show, because we've already had examples, and we didn't do these I didn't put them in the lessons, but note that you have all of that with all his administration and all the administrators and all of that, right? He's got all that set up, so he's got the administration set up, he's built himself a nice house, he built the temple, he's done everything right as far as those types of things go. He's organized, he's following the law, those things are all going well. That's the point of all of this first stuff, is to tell you that he turned out good. That's what it is. That's what we would say. He turned out good.
For a while.
Do what? For a while, yeah. Be careful what you say. All right. Question that I had asked, the outer rooms of the temple, right? So at 1 Kings 6, 5 through 6. Listen, and I love questions. So if y'all ever have questions as you're doing your readings or whatever, this reading I think happened to be from Sunday. If you have questions as you go throughout the week or whatever, or even if it's for next week or whatever, or the previous week even, feel free to ask, and I'll look into those. And because this was not an odd question, but it was an odd thing somewhat. But it makes more sense than it did initially. 1 Kings 6, 5 through 6. it says, so this is the building of the temple, right? So you've got the main part in the middle that has the holiest places, the Holy of Holies, and then the inner sanctum and all these different places, right, where the priests go. But then on the outskirts of that, so you have the main, opening here, and then you have around these three sides, so the two sides and then the back, you have these, basically they're storage rooms, right? And so it says, he also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits broad, the middle one was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For around the outside of the house, he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should be inserted into the walls of the house. So the question was about the fact that the bottom room is smaller, and then the next room is bigger, and then the next room is bigger, right? And there's no definitive explanation as to why that is. However, it seems to be because it's just support for the upper rooms. And so you have basically the walls of this bottom room then support the next room up, right? And then the next is supported by the next up. And so it just provides support for that next floor. Hello. And so that seems to just be a functional reason. I couldn't find any other better reason for it. And most people just ignored it completely. Most of the commentators I read.
Well, it bothered me because I could see the building going like this on the outside, and that's not the pictures they showed.
Yes.
They showed it was the inside wall, and that the floor would really be supported by that. And it was a step up that just got thinner and thinner. And
that's what I was going to say, is that one of the commentators did say that those areas would have stairs going up to the next floor. And so ultimately, I guess it's possible that the whole space is still straight. Now, clearly the outside wall is still straight and the inside wall is still straight. But if you have a smaller room and then you build stairs up to the next, so then you have this room with the stairs coming up, and then you have stairs going up this way to where the top room goes out to there. So basically the stairs fill in at least part of that extra space on the outsides of the at the outside.
You would need a walkway around there for entry into the rooms, and that overhang would provide that walkway.
I'm trying to think how that would say that again now. So if you have a room like this,
extended the timbers across and extended them further out to where you'd have to have a walkway around there to access the upper chambers.
I guess I'm envisioning in my mind where it's
just describing the room.
Right, but then the stairs on the outskirts of it, though, would open into that part of the room. So you'd have the walls come out with the room opening, and then around to the stairs where you could go up, and then you go into the room.
Had its own stairway.
I think that's it. I think that is what it's. I think so. But again, nobody knows for sure. But it seems to be that each one has its own set of stairs.
And one thing Joe talks about, different sizes of the stones that as you go up.
It does.
The foundation is the widest.
Yes.
And you can narrow.
Right.
You can narrow up each story, so you're losing 24 inches, 2 feet at a time.
Yeah.
So you can step back 2 feet and navigate each room.
So that would change a little bit
So the walls
also.
be straight
Yes.
on the outside and on the inside, but then the
Right.
foundation will take.
Right.
step back.
Did you see that in there too? That the blocks on the bottom floors, as you go up, the blocks that build up the rooms are bigger on the bottom floors. Then when you go to the next, the blocks were smaller, and then when you got to the top room, it seemed to be that the block was fairly narrow, and so that was another thing. Yeah, right. So that's another deal. But again, as far as exactly how that worked, we don't know. It's lost obviously, and so yeah. 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 Hey, you ask good questions though, because there's never a definitive answer to any of your questions, which means
I can choose whatever.
you have obviously been able to solve all of the issues that other people have solved, and the ones that they can't solve, you also can't solve. So that puts you in pretty good company. All right. Notice at 1 Kings 6:38 and then 7:1. It says, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. All right, this is at 1 Kings 6:38 and 7:1. Note that the house there that he's talking about is the house of God, right? So it's the temple. So how long did he take to build that? Solomon was building his own house 13 years, right? So his house is much larger. Now, let me just say, though, the Temple of Solomon was spectacular, right? Like, it was a spectacular temple. But notice that he spent a lot more time building his own house. So that may be and it always says that. Every time it mentions him building the house and then building the temple and such, it always mentions the fact that it took him 13 years to build his own house and 7 years to build God's house. And so that could be a kind of a backhanded. Yeah. All right. Solomon builds the Hall of Justice. This is also in his house. So that is part of it. At least there's that. I mean, so part of it is for administration and such. At 1 Kings 7:7, it says, and he made the hall of the throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters, right? And so this is literally where he sits, and he hears cases from people as they come in, and he administers justice. 1 Kings reiterates that justice is to set Israel, its God, and its king apart, right? So again, like we said before, but at 1 Kings 8:59 through 61, it says, let these words of mine, with which I have pleaded before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, and may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel as each day requires, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God. There is no other. Let your heart therefore be wholly true to the Lord our God, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments as to this day, right? And so in the context there, he's talking about justice and judgment. And so he's saying again, this is all a reflection on God and on Israel. And as he's the king, it's a reflection on the king as well. So again, big deal. Okay. So there are two pillars out in front of the main opening for the temple, right? And they are not, apparently, even though some scholars will argue, they don't seem to be for support. They just seem to be decorative, okay? And what's interesting about these pillars, they have names, right? So it's like they have names. Now, in our family, we name all of our cars, right? So every car has a name. And so I have a Genesis. And so my car's name is, it's a female name. Eve. Did you say it? Well, you obviously know. It's funny, someone was in my car the other day and they said, oh, it's a Genesis. Did you name it Eve? And I was like, yeah. And then he laughed. He laughed at me like that was stupid. I'm like, well, you thought of it too. All right. So why then do the pillars have names? So notice at 1 Kings 7:21, it says he set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Yakin. And he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz, right? So he named the pillars. He's all like, hey, they should have names. Why do they have names? All right, so note that the names are going to be likely based on the inscriptions that are on the pillars, right? And so it's similar to today when you have like buildings named after people, right? And so if you donate money or whatever, and then they name a library after you, right? And so it's a similar idea. And so they would do that in the ancient world. They would put names of people and inscriptions about them. But in this case, it seems likely that it's about the king and his rule and his relationship with God and all of that. It's probably that those two words, it's not Boaz the person, and I'm not going to go into all the nerdy detail about Hebrew and stuff, but it's likely the first words in the inscriptions themselves. And one scholar, back in 1939, right, he wrote an article, and his last name's Scott. And so he figured it out, and it's an article that you can read. If you would like to read that article, I will gladly give it to you. But so this is what he came up with after a bunch of grammatical stuff, and the king's here at this time, and in that passage it says this, and blah, blah, blah. All right, drum roll, please. This is what he says that the inscriptions likely said, right? But we don't know this, right? We don't know this for sure. But one is, he will establish the throne of David and his kingdom for his offspring forever, right? And the second is, in the strength of Yahweh shall the king rejoice. And so, again, it is logical, the reason that he came up with those inscriptions. But again, we can't know. It is very likely, though, that whatever those two names have to do with the inscriptions themselves and what they say, right? And so that's the reason they have names. It's just, it's funny. It's like, have you ever done a Word document? Like, let's say you put your name at the top of a Word document, and then you space down a few times, and then you start typing. Well, then it auto saves it as your name, right? And so that's the first thing in the document. Whatever the first thing in your Word document is, that's the way Word will save it if you don't save it as something else. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's just representative of what it says. All right, again, now, as many of you know, I'm a musician. And so I always find it interesting, again, when we look at, and listen, I have close friends that are in the Church of Christ, right? I don't have anything against really the Church of Christ except for a couple of theological issues. And one of those is that they do not have musical instruments in worship. Now listen, if you don't want to have musical instruments in your worship, more power to you, right? But to say that it goes against the Bible, then now we have a problem, right? Because to me, that's a major theological issue, because you've said if you do it, you're going against God, right? Now, my friends aren't particularly that, but I'm not gonna out them in that, because I'm just not going to. I could tell you why, but then I can't tell you that either, because it would give it away. So let's just say people can't know that they're not that particular about that, because it'd be bad. And I can't tell you, so don't even. No, I'm just kidding. I tend to overshare, so I have to like, no, I can't tell you. All right. So the reason that they do that, though, is for a noble reason, right? It's because, again, when the Church of Christ, when they get and they look at the New Testament, they say, okay, anything that is not specifically okayed in the New Testament, if it's not specifically in there, then we're not going to do it, right? And so what they're going to say is that there's no place in the New Testament where they use musical instruments in the worship of God, in the temple, or anything like that. And so therefore, we're just, for safety's sake, we're not going to do it, because we don't want to add to the Word of God, right? But again, the book of Revelation, which again is highly symbolic, but still, they clearly use musical instruments in the worship of God before the throne in the book of Revelation, right? And so even if it's just symbolic and that's not literally what's going on, it wouldn't present it that way if using musical instruments to worship God was a bad thing, right? So clearly it wouldn't have that there. In the Old Testament, you have several places where there's musical instruments used in the worship of God. And so one of those that's just definitive is here at 2 Chronicles, which is part of the reading, right? So it's one of the parallel passages. 2 Chronicles 5, 7 through 14. It says, and this is when we're bringing the Ark of the Covenant and putting it in the temple. So this is a major deal. We're bringing the throne or the footstool of God, whichever passage you look at, but it's an important thing to God, right? We're bringing it's His presence. It symbolizes His presence. We're bringing it to the temple, okay? And it says, then the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh to its place in their inner sanctuary. This is 2 Chronicles 5, 7 through 14. I don't know if I said that. They brought the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place underneath the wings of the cherubim. So note again, you have the cherubim. Remember that cherubim are not little babies with wings. that way downplays the significance of what a cherubim is. A cherubim is a large griffin-style creature that has multiple animal characteristics and humongous wings, right? And so what's interesting here is you have the Ark of the Covenant, which has cherubim on it, and their wings go out and they reach in the middle. And then in the temple itself, you have these humongous cherubim that are then over that. And so then they're also doing a similar deal. Their wings spread from side to side of the inner sanctuary of the temple, right? The cherubim spread out the wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary. But they could not be seen from outside, and they are there to this day, right? So again, to this day, obviously it's not today, it's when this was written, right? And when was this written? We don't know exactly, right? But, I mean, we can guesstimate, right? So it's obviously when the temple was still standing, so it would have had to have been before 586 BC, right? So we figure 600 or sometime before 600, right? This is something that we're going to talk about. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, for all the priests who were present had consecrated themselves without regard to their divisions, and all the Levitical singers, Asaph, Haman, and Jeduthun, the sons of kinsmen, arrayed in fine linen with cymbals, harps, lyres, stood east of the altar with 120 priests who were trumpeters, right? So we have lots of musical aids, like we have a full jazz band here, right? And it was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to make themselves heard in unison in praise and thanksgiving to Yahweh. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to Yahweh, right? For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The house of Yahweh was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of God, right? And so again, listen, I mean, if Yahweh gets that excited about musical instruments in the Old Testament, I'm going to guess that he didn't change his mind. He's like, you know what? I don't want to listen to musical instruments anymore. It's like when I grew up playing my guitar, my parents would be like, shut that noise off. My stepdad hurt my feelings one time. He never showed any interest in my guitar playing because I listened to heavy metal music. And so which, so shocking, he didn't want to listen to it, right? And so he came in one day and he said, can you play a solo? And I was like, yeah, what kind do you want to hear? And he said, one solo, I can't hear it. And I was like, I'm shocked that y'all laughed at that. And that's a true, just for the record, that's a true story. He really did do that. And it really did at the time, it cut me pretty deep. I was like, wow. But now as an adult and a father with a son, I'm like, I get you. I understand. All right, so the contents of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So there's some ambiguity as to exactly what's in the Ark of the Covenant. Because Hebrews says that the Ark of the Covenant included the tablets, some manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, right? And so at Hebrews 9:4 it says, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant, right? So that's in the New Testament, right? Hebrews says that those are the things that were in there. Now, keep in mind, it's been going for a long time. It seems most likely, and I did look at it a little more because, we talked about it kind of in passing one day, and I got to thinking about it. And so it's definitely in the temple here, but we really don't hear about it again, the Ark of the Covenant. So it's very likely that when the Babylonians came in 586, it's likely that they took it and destroyed it or whatever happened to it until Indiana Jones found it. Yes. And it melted those Nazis' faces off. All right. Second Chronicles, note that Second Chronicles states that only the tablets were in the ark, right? So Second Chronicles 5:10 says, there was nothing in the ark, which we just read, except the 2 tablets that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt, right? So Exodus at 16:32 through 34 says that the manna was actually placed in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So at Exodus 16:32 through 34, it says, Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations, as the Lord commanded Moses." So Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept, right? So it seems to be that it's in front of the Ark of the Covenant or something like that. And then Numbers says that the staff was also in front of the Ark, right? So Numbers 17:10 through 11 says, "And the Lord said to Moses, put back the staff of Aaron before the testimony," which again seems to be in front of it, "to be kept as a sign for the rebels, that you may make an end of their grumblings against me, lest they die. Thus did Moses, as the Lord commanded him, so he did." Right? So again, regardless of how you look at it and whether, listen, it's possible, I don't know. I don't think they opened it and like took stuff in and put stuff out. You know, it's not like, let's put it up today and let's hide, whatever. Because, again, you don't want to get your face melted off. And so, but it's clearly closely associated with the Ark of the Covenant, the manna and the staff. So they seem to be presented with it. And so the author of Hebrews just kind of conflates all that together and says that that's what was with it, the Ark of the Covenant. So again, all right. So it discusses in our readings at 1 Kings 8:65. Then this is just kind of so and kind of to bring out an interesting little point. And I'm actually going to read it from the New Living Translation because the way it describes it. And I knew that it said other places, Festival of Shelters. I didn't really look at it in the ESV to see where it says the different things, and you'll understand what I'm saying in a second. So they celebrated at the bringing of the ark into the temple, right? And so they're celebrating what the New Living Translation calls the Festival of Shelters, right? So it says that 1 Kings 8:65, it says, "Then Solomon and all Israel celebrated the Festival of Shelters in the presence of Yahweh our God. A large congregation had gathered from as far away as Lebo Hamath in the north and the brook of Egypt in the south. The celebration went on for 14 days, and all 7 days for the dedication of the altar, and 7 days for the Festival of Shelters." So note that this is going to be the Festival of Shelters, Tabernacles, or booths, right? So what that really means for us today, I'm going to add another word, tents, right? It's just tents, okay? And what the festival and the Feast of Tabernacles is it commemorates the time that God provided for Israel in the wilderness wanderings, right? And so God provided manna and quail and all of that, and they lived in tents. And God lived in a tent as well, right? Or listen, technically, and even in the temple, right? And I didn't put the exact verse in here, but just for the record, even the Israelites did not believe that God was confined into the temple, right? They believed that his name was there, right? And I didn't go into all that detail. Maybe at a later date we'll do that. But it's the name of God that's there. They don't believe that God is fully stuck in the temple, right? And so, but much of his presence is there. And so I just want you to understand that they don't believe he's confined somehow, that he has to stay or whatever. All right. So they commemorate this whole God's provision in the wilderness wanderings. And now Israel is in the land, right? And so therefore they no longer have to stay in tents and stuff, right? So they build their houses and everything. Well, now God has a house. And so now they're celebrating during the Festival of Tabernacles, they're celebrating the fact that they no longer have to live in tents. And God also no longer has to live in a tent because now there's a temple for God. And so his name can be there. His presence, which is in the cloud and all of that, can be there. And so he is also no longer wandering around in the wilderness as far as the fact that they had the tabernacle itself. And so that's the reason that they picked this time, is because it memorializes the fact that we no longer have to do all that, right? And so that is a festival, of course, that they celebrate all the way, even today, right? Okay. So at 1 Kings 9, 4 through 9, it discusses again the covenant blessings and curses concerning Solomon. So it just re-ups the covenant, right? It's like, hey, look, you get all these nice things as long as you just do what you're supposed to do. But if you don't, right? So it's like when you tell your kids, right? You're doing such a good job, but if you stop, you'll be in trouble, right? So at 1 Kings 9, 4 through 9, and as for you, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So again, a family line. Note, if, right? If you do these things. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them. It's like God told you not to do that. Like, I would like to think that I would not be so hard-headed, but Then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And Ezekiel sees that. Ezekiel sees in a vision God's glory leaving the temple and all of that, and then God leaves the temple and he's gone, right? And so that, of course, all of this happens. We know in hindsight, right, that all of this ends up happening. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss. And they will say, why has Yahweh done thus to this land and to this house? So notice this is written back, and it's like saying, when all this stuff is destroyed, people will be like, man, how did Yahweh let this happen? Like, he must not be very powerful, or, what's the deal? It says, then they will say, because they abandoned Yahweh, their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore, the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. It's like when you see a Facebook rant, from somebody, and they're all like, they did this thing to me, and I didn't have no idea. And then the other person comes on and says, it's because you did this. And then everybody's like, oh, got it, right? So that's the deal. It's like when people are looking and they're like, man, the temple's destroyed and his people's exiled. Like, God, Yahweh's not very powerful. And he's like, no. That's exactly what I wanted to happen to them because they did not do what I told them, and this is what Yahweh does. Remember when we talked about all that stuff about justice and the law and all of that stuff? Remember we said God will be glorified either way, whether they follow the law or they don't follow the law, because either they'll look and say, wow, look how Yahweh's people prosper because they follow his law, or they'll look and they'll say, man, Yahweh does not play around when his people don't do what they're supposed to do, right? Either way, Yahweh is glorified. And so ultimately it doesn't matter. Now, obviously, God doesn't want his people to do badly, but ultimately Yahweh still looks good. And that's the point, is to show that Yahweh is powerful and that what he expects from his people, so that eventually, we get to the New Testament, it's still Yahweh, and then he provides a way, obviously, through Jesus and all of that. But we're way away from that at this point. All right. 2 Chronicles 1, 14 through 17. Notice these things, and we've read this a few times in the last few weeks. So this again, of course, is a parallel passage. 2 Chronicles 1, 14 through 17. It says, Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots. Ooh, look at him. And 1,200 horsemen. I'm sorry, 12,000 horsemen. Wow, I don't do numbers. I don't teach English, right? I don't teach math. Wow, what am I saying? I do teach English. I don't teach math. It's been a long year, okay? And graduation is tomorrow night, so give me a break. Let's just start that over. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stone. And he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses, note that, I'll say that again without stopping. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Q, and the king's traders would buy them from Q for a price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150, right? So that's the cost of each, right? Likewise, through them, these were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. Well, if you will remember, over the last few weeks, we've looked back at Deuteronomy 17, 15 through 17, which really we looked at, I think it's 13 through 19. But to cut just to the middle part, the context here is the Israelites were absolutely expected to have a king, right? That's not the problem. The problem is the king is expected to follow God and not do certain things. So as long as Solomon doesn't do those certain things, whoops, right? Because it says, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord, this is after you've gotten into the land, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers. You shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Solomon fits the bill. He's not a foreigner, right? But the rest of it, only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives, which we haven't done yet, but we know that's coming in the next, well, technically next week's Proverbs, but we'll get there soon. Lest his heart turn away, we know that happens, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So again, as we often see, it seems that people in the Bible have a checklist of what they shouldn't do, and they just do all those things, like check, check. Let's see, we're not supposed to have horses from Egypt. Check. Lots of gold and silver. Check. Right? And so, again, so you have a tension there between he is blessed by God, but then he still does things that he's not supposed to be doing, right? And as we talked about last week, he pretty much sets up his kingdom like who? Like Egypt. He sets his kingdom up like Egypt, right? And so, which is bad. The first thing he does is marry an Egyptian woman and enter into a treaty with Egypt. And so he obviously likes Egypt. He's buying all these horses and chariots and stuff from Egypt. This is what he wants. He looks at Egypt and he says, hey, we want to be like Egypt, right? Just like, if we look and we say, over in Europe and, whatever country, they got whatever fancy thing. We want to be like that. I'm like, no, we don't want to be like that, right? And that's the problem, right? He wants to be like everybody else. And that's the Old Testament problem. We always want to be like everybody else, right? That's an issue. It's like the church, and listen, this is just for the record, this is not a code for contemporary music or anything, because I like contemporary music, okay? So it's not a code for that. But it is like other churches in other places, like particularly churches that deal in the prosperity gospel, where they try to make, their churches more, it's less about the gospel, certainly less about judgment and hell and things like that, which you don't want to go to a church so they talk about hell all the time. But I mean, you would like to know that it's there and that it's a potential issue, right? I mean, we definitely want that preached, and all of that. And so, we get churches that just want to be like, self-help places where you go and feel good about yourself and all of that. And they want everything to seem very familiar, like outside, like everything else is, right? And so that's a problem. And again, our church doesn't do anything like that, right? So, that's an issue, and that's why you have some of those churches that are humongous. It's because they're not really church. It's more like you just go feel good about yourself. You rock out just music and then go home and keep doing whatever you're doing, right? Because you're never going to be told you can't do those things at your church, right? So that's exactly what they're doing, right? They want to be like everybody else. Solomon's setting up like Egypt, exactly what he's not supposed to do. And that's going to get him in trouble. And then all these wives that he's going to all these treaties with other nations, they're going to end up getting him to worship the other gods. And at that point, he's done. Kingdom splits, and things go from bad to worse. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.